All right. Hello, everyone. And this is another episode of the Work Item Podcast. And following our streak of excellent guests, today we have Jess Lee. Welcome, Jess.
Hey, everyone. Hey, Dan. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. So, Jess, why don't you tell us more about what you do? I know that I followed you on Twitter for some time, and I know what you do, but I know that our audience is very diverse and broad. So, I'd love to learn more from kind of Jess in your own words.
Awesome. Yeah. So I am one of the co-founders of Forem, and Forem is the open source software that powers communities like the dev community and the code newbie community and a bunch of others. We've been working on this essentially since 2017. Before that, it was a bit of a side project, but we've been full time on it since 2017, and it started off as a community just for developers, like the dev community, but now we are focused on growing Forem to enable other community creators to build their communities with our open source software.
And I love the work that you're doing with dev.to. And I know that some of my colleagues at Microsoft were always referring to it as one of the examples of how to do community right. So we'll get to that in our podcast as well. But I want to start a little bit with your career. So you have a very rich background. You have background in music publishing. You have background in marketing, business analysis. You've been a product manager. How did it all lead to where you are today?
Rich is a very kind way of putting it. I studied music in college, which is how I ultimately ended up working in music publishing. But you sort of quickly get thrown into that world, and I realized that industry really wasn't for me. It kind of took away all the passion that I had for music, like knowing how the sausage got made. And so I ultimately ended up working for a temp agency, actually, and I got placed at a startup, and that's where I did the business analysis type of work. But while I was at that startup, I realized that developers were the only folks treated as first-class citizens there, and that sort of led me to be like, oh, like I want to be a developer. So I ended up enrolling in a boot camp, learn how to code. But another part of my whole career dilemma at that point in time was wanting to really work for an organization that I believed in. The music industry left me kind of jaded. Ultimately, I found a nonprofit that was empowering young people to take social action. And I really was excited by their mission, but they didn't have any developer roles open there. And so that put me on that product manager route. And then, in many ways, it probably gave me that capacity to hack away on nights and weekends on dev.to. So yeah, that's, I think, the briefest way of describing my eclectic background.
I still stand by the fact that it's a very rich background, purely because you had this wealth of experiences that you get from these different roles. Did you have a career map, if you will, or, once you decided that music is not for you, just kind of draw out of, here's the things that I want to do long-term, or is it more of just kind of, I'm open to opportunities, and this was one of those opportunities?
The latter is definitely spot on. So we actually, we have a set of values and principles at Forem, and our principles are meant to guide our day-to-day. And one of them is to plan for opportunism. I think that resonates with all three. We have three founders. Ben and Peter are my co-founders, but I think that resonates with all three of us. And it's sort of a good example of that. I think we all probably have a loose plan of what we envision, but then just being able to say yes to opportunities. And that's sort of always been my mindset.
So I'm curious now, you call out principles, and we've heard that recently in one of our recent episodes that we recorded with our friend Charlie Kindle, who was a VP at some other companies. And he also emphasized on how important it is that an organization has principles. How has that worked for you? Why was it important to have principles instead of just kind of, hey, we have this product, we're going to ship this product, that's our goal?
Sure. I think what's actually been most helpful for our team by creating these set of principles is to have this shared language. So another one that we use pretty commonly across the company is closing the loop, and we apply that to how we communicate with one another. We're a async, fully remote company distributed across I think 8 different time zones right now. Um, and so, we want to make sure that when we communicate, we close the loop with our team members, we close the loop with our community members, and also with our open source contributors. Like, even our like bounty hunters, we want to make sure we close the loop with them too. But then, like, if we think about it from the product perspective, and this was probably a lot more applicable when you're first building a product, where like anything you add is kind of a value add at that point. But being deliberate of like whether or not we're going to continue with a feature, or if we're going to like deliberately stop iterating, so we sort of try and close the loop in that product sense as well.
Something that I'm actually really interested to hear more about is you mentioned that your company is fully remote. And for the past year, a lot of companies were kind of forced into getting in this mode of operation where we can go to the office. We are no longer commuting to our cubicles or open spaces. How has the past year changed for your own company?
So we were definitely one of the lucky ones in this situation. The fact that we were already equipped to be remote made a huge difference. We weren't scrambling to buy like laptops or like desks for our team members to help them create, ad hoc workspaces. We had all that in place already. So we're so lucky that that was the case for us. But of course, there's just like a huge mental toll that I think the world is sharing right now that we're in. And so the biggest change was just like really ensuring that like our team members knew that they could take the time that they needed to care for their like mental health, to care for the people in their lives, and to just make it clear that like we're not in normal times right now, and that's okay. And that's the messaging like we're continuing to share with the team as we continue on. Like vaccines are rolling out, but it's still going to be quite some time before things are normalized. And if anything, I feel like right now has been like another sort of time of like people feeling a bit more burnt out, now that we're like several weeks into the new year, and people maybe got some rest during the holidays, but kind of feeling like it's been a long time. Like we're like the US is hitting that 1 year mark where a lot of places went into lockdown.
And so, in terms of fostering this healthy internal culture, making sure that folks don't burn out and making sure that everyone is successful and still delivers, how do you structure your communications, or how do you structure your approach to work to make sure that it's a healthy environment where folks thrive instead of adding another stressful thing through the stress that we see around us?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something we're always iterating on. I think the biggest change we made recently was creating an internal forum for our team to use. So, like I mentioned, Forum is just software that you can use to build communities. So, if you look at Dev, that is an example of a forum. But what we did was create a private version of that for our team, and that really enabled us to communicate just much more asynchronously in the way that Slack couldn't offer. So I think giving folks that peace of mind, like, hey, if I miss a day, if I miss this meeting, like all the information will be captured in the team forum. And I won't have to, spend the time endlessly scrolling within Slack. So yeah, I'd say Slack and our internal forum is how we've been communicating primarily, but we also manage all of our projects through GitHub for both technical and non-technical work. So that's sort of our third place that we call home. And then also just our internal, just general documentation. The company forum is more for, we'll have just like random topics in there from like water cooler stuff, but also just like announcements. So it's more of like an internal memo message board versus like, documentation for anything that changes where people need that information. Yeah, to reference.
How do you deal with Zoom fatigue? Because for me personally, I know that's one of the big things that
Yeah.
every meeting is in a video and you're just like all day. And I know that some folks treat it as, well, we're in video, so it's kind of like we are in person, but not really. What
Yeah.
was the
Oh
experience
man.
like?
I cannot, like I'm on Zoom quite a bit. And I can't do any like socializing on Zoom, with like friends and family. I'm like, I can't, like Zoom is fully for work for me. But so something we did that I actually think we did before the pandemic, but we have no meeting Mondays. And so, oh sorry, we have no meeting Fridays. Um and so, this is the only Zoom call I'm having today. Well, we're not on Zoom, but this is the only video call that I'm having today, and it's really nice. So like Fridays, you can expect to get that heads down time that you want, or duck out early if you need to. But at the very least, you should not be having any meetings. So that's one way we've just reduced meetings. And this is a small thing that we've done, but I love it and wish more folks would adopt it. But we only do 25 or 50-minute meetings. So this way you're guaranteed to have that buffer time that you need to like take a bio break, or grab some water, close your eyes for a second before you have to be overstimulated by a group of squares and like talking at you. So I'd say that we try really hard to reduce meetings, and also also because we are remotely distributed, it's really hard and to get folks like on a meeting. Yeah, like it's we have our all hands where everyone on the team gathers, but we rotate it through 3 different time zones. So we don't actually get everyone on the team because that's impossible. If we did that, someone will be up at 6 a.m. and another person will be up at like, 12 a.m., which is totally unreasonable. So just by being spread out globally like this, we're like pretty anti-meeting.
Yeah, and it's especially a challenge when you have different time zones, as you very astutely called out, because I had the experience of working with a team in China, and we
Hmm.
always have to align, the 5 p.m. for us, it's the start of
Yep.
day for them. And having this balance of when you actually have meetings, when you can just send a doc and have people just
Yeah.
comment on the doc on their time. Nobody needs to get up at 6 a.m. to make sure that they can join that one final review.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I love your outline of how you're fostering the culture. And I want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about your personal career. And what stood out to me is you were talking about kind of education in the musical field. Then you went through a boot camp, and it goes counter to one of the very common tropes or narratives where it's, you've determine your passion in college and then pursue it like no matter what through your entire life. So you took a turn that is not only, I want to say, non-traditional in a sense, but it's very unique in that you went from music to computers. And what was that journey like for you, right? Like that must be a pretty hard decision to make when you're saying, you know what, I know that I've been pursuing education in field X, and now I'm jumping into field Y.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was at a time in my life where just any change was good. So it wasn't so scary as it was exciting. And I think, like, living in New York City, I was excited for a future where I didn't have to like juggle 3 different jobs. um, and yeah, so I'd say it was mostly exciting. But I will also add that one of my co-founders, Peter, I think, um, encapsulates a lot more of what you were describing. He is a serial entrepreneur, started his own business in college, pivoted a few times, and ultimately landed up, co-founding Forem together. And so, like that background has been part of the recipe, I think, for our success. But I do think, having this non-traditional background offers another perspective. I didn't even know what a startup was 6 years ago. So it's been, yeah, it's been a crazy journey, but it's been a lot of fun.
So, given the switch to a completely new field, what's your approach to learning new things? Now, I'm curious because this is one of those things that different people approach it differently, and there's no single recipe. But when it comes to learning, say, a programming language or a framework, and I know I've encountered that myself, where starting from scratch is hard, and when you know nothing about the field, and I often find myself in a position where I know absolutely nothing about, say, machine learning or AI, and then I start kind of going through the process, going through the motions. What's your approach? How do you learn new things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For coding specifically, there were just so many resources online that you can kind of jump right in, and the more interactive things definitely stuck out to me initially. And also, like I always sort of played around on the internet, like as a kid, like tweaking like LiveJournal or Zanga themes and all of that was all considered fun, and so it was cool to see that kind of be a career path. But I'd say in general, and I don't know if this is advice I would give, but I tend to learn by trial and error, and that's very possible when you're coding. There's this instant gratification, and it's actually quite similar to when you're learning how to play an instrument. It's like you either get it right or you get it wrong, and you can kind of like keep doing it. There's like interpretations of how you approach or play certain things, or find certain solutions. The reason I don't know if I like advise that is because I probably could have spent a lot more time like reading through documentation when I first started learning how to code, and like really trying to like grok the fundamentals. But we do live in a culture of instant gratification, and so it's a lot easier to go down like this trial and error route.
It actually resonates because I learned exactly the same way. To me, it's easier to try it out,
Yeah.
fiddle with the IDE, and see what comes out instead of, oh, I'll spend a couple hours reading docs and tutorials.
Right.
So I'll just Google it, or Google it with Bing to see what actually needs to come out. And yeah, no, one of those things that I use the analogy when I tell people that it's like asking how to learn guitar. You can read a book on how to do it, but unless you actually practice it, you will never know, right?
Totally.
So you can do a lot of tutorials, blog posts. What are your favorite resources to learn? And I know dev.to, or the practical dev, the dev community is one of them. What else? Where do you go to learn?
So I would recommend checking out the Code Newbie podcast to if you're starting your coding journey. We actually just launched a Code Newbie forum where the content there, while it's similar to dev and like layout, the content's really, really like extra friendly for early career developers, people who are learning, or just any like a seasoned developer that might be learning something new, like you when you're talking about machine learning. So I would say those are two resources, and we're actually in the process of launching the Code Newbie Challenge, where we challenge you to, get your first job in software engineering, to blog more about software engineering, or to just learn how to code. So there's a lot of things there that you can look into, but otherwise, they've made it so much more fun to learn how to code even in the last 5 years. I I know that Twitch has this Twilio Quest game that a lot of people have raved about that seems really fun and supportive, if you're just starting out, and it's not like focused on their API or anything like that, but back to the fundamentals there.
And even folks that learn how to code with Minecraft, that was
Yeah.
beautiful too. Like seeing this kind of fun experience where when I was growing up, I certainly did not have video games in which I can say, you know what, mom and dad, I'm actually learning how to code. So let me play this for hours and hours on end. So we're definitely evolving that. And I actually want to switch gears, and this is a nice segue into community work. And you've co-founded dev.to. What was the motivation behind that effort? What inspired you to say that we need a whole new community? Because you take a very unique approach that is not Stack Overflow. It is not your typical forum. What was that for you?
Yeah, so upon graduating from the boot camp, what they don't tell you when you like churn out is just how lonely it can be afterwards. You're in this boot camp, you talk to the same people every single day, you have teachers, and just lots of resources, a Slack channel, and then all of a sudden you're just like on an island by yourself. And so when I first graduated, I didn't know how to stay up to date with the industry. I didn't know how to meet other people. And that's when I met my other co-founder, Ben, who I don't think I've mentioned yet. But he, despite not being like a bootcamp grad, he's actually self-taught, but had been working as a developer. He also felt the same way. And so it really came to came down to like, is Reddit as best as it gets here? Like, because I didn't really feel comfortable posting there. I didn't feel comfortable asking questions on Stack Overflow because I felt like I would get shut down. Um, when I was at the bootcamp, our instructors actually told us to create like a fake dummy account on Stack Overflow if we had questions, like in case we got shut down, so that it wasn't associated with our like actual professional profiles. And I was like, okay, like, but is this the world that I'm in right now? And sharing these feelings with Ben, learning that he felt the same way, was I think the impetus for this whole thing. And with Ben, he was actually already fostering a community online through Twitter, through the Practical Dev Twitter account, where he was sort of poking fun at the daily lives of being a programmer, but just also wanting to have a more inclusive space. And so we started working on dev.to together.
That is such a sad state of affairs that you have to create a fake account to get
I
help
know.
with questions. But that being said, dev.to is thriving. Like, we see just so much goodness coming out of that community. And you actually called out the importance of being extra friendly for new folks. Why do you think that is important? Why do you think that kind of extra nice approach to explaining things and making sure that folks don't feel alienated is good? Because arguably, if you talk to any other community founder, they say, no, we enforce strict moderation policies because we want our content to be high quality. We want to make sure that if we got the Google juice and the SEO, that people can find the exact answer to their problem. And you again take a very radically different approach in a good way. Why was that key?
I mean, I think part of it was like just scratching our own itch and what we needed and wanted to see. Repeat questions are totally valid. And answers can constantly evolve, especially in engineering when there's like a million different ways to answer a question. So I never fully understood like why a repeated question would get shut down, because there's just like new ways to respond. But I think it's important to be extra friendly because it lowers the barrier for contribution and for people to join that conversation. If we couldn't create an environment where people could be part of the conversation, we're going to see a lot more of what we currently have demographic wise. You know, and for early career developers, they're really coming from all different walks of life. And to help people feel like they can actually thrive here, I think that's just a prerequisite nowadays, is to, just make coding a lot more accessible and make the community, make everyone feel like they can belong there. And that's actually one of our company values. So it's not just like how we think about communities for software, but communities across the board, and how we treat our team too.
That is a wonderful approach to this, because you're so right in the take on repeat questions, because technology has evolved. Something that was asked in 2012 is probably, the solution from 2012 is not maybe as applicable in 2021.
Yeah,
So just
exactly.
because it's a question, why not ask it again and give a better answer or a different answer?
Yeah, and it even like gives somebody else the opportunity to respond too, and like that could be really valuable for that individual as well. So I know it's like, people are like, it's annoying, but it's like, I mean, is it? Like, how annoying is that?
Right. And to me personally, it's never annoying, because you get perspectives and you get takes on somebody decided to implement it in a different way, maybe using a different library or using a different code path. And that's fine. You can uncover completely new solutions. And I like your approach to taking the friendly route, because I know for myself and my own experience that it was very intimidating to post on any kind of forum.
Yeah.
Exactly because of the idea that, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe maybe my idea is not the valid idea. And having somebody say in a friendly manner, hey, maybe you should consider X, Y, and Z instead of what you're doing right now, could be a better approach, would work much more helpful than just lock my question and say not valid, duplicate. And it's just, I like your approach to fostering the community.
Yeah.
So
I'll just share this one thing that that Ben shares sometimes, but I know he had this one experience where he actually I believe he asked the question on Stack Overflow, and then like said thank you to somebody and that comment like got downvoted or was against the rules because it wasn't like productive, like by saying thank you in advance, I think was something like a comment that he had left on it. But that just like goes to show like how how tough it can get, if you are overly strict with your rules and like not considering the nuances. Yeah.
Right. The most recent example to that was a post from somebody who's an expert in WebGL. And they essentially said that they're quitting Stack Overflow because their comments got deleted. And their comments were essentially, hey, I wrote a whole blog post on this topic. Check it out here. And that got deleted because it's not helpful. And to me as a developer, I'd say, that's 100% helpful because I want to read the blog post if I need to elaborate on a question. Why is that being deleted? But this overzealous quest for perfection and every bit and following to the letter, it's not healthy. And that's why it's so great to see your take on fostering community.
Yeah, and I think part of that is the relationship that they've built with their moderators as well. You know, there needs to be checks and balances in how you approach moderation. And yeah, I mean, like for our moderators, we keep things like pretty loose, and it's a lot more like values driven than it is like strict rules. And we have places for our mods to like really talk to each other and connect with someone on our team to discuss the things that are in the gray area. But Stack Overflow has been around for a really long time. They've been an amazing resource for people. And I know that they've been evolving to try and address a lot of these issues.
And so for the MVP or the minimum viable product for your community, in Startup Land, there's this mantra of always start with an MVP. Build what customers want, test it. You mentioned that there was the Twitter account kind of preceded the community. Was that your MVP? And if so, how did it actually indicate you that something like this is necessary, or how did you validate the typical startup hypotheses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that's arguably what our MVP was, and Ben drove much of that during that time since he had started that account. But it wasn't. And maybe Ben would say something different. But I don't think it was so deliberate at first, but it was more like testing the waters to understand and purely out of just our desire to connect with other developers who, were shared similar thoughts and feelings as us in terms of wanting to create, this positive dialogue, and also just to be able to sort of introspectively make fun of programming. And by amassing sort of like the following and engagement he did, he realized like, oh, like there needs to be like a home for these type of conversations. Twitter can be so ephemeral, it just kind of disappears, and if you missed it, you missed it. And so I think if we were to really look at that very proving of the hypothesis, I'd say Twitter was a start. But then there I don't think we like had an MVP drawn out for dev.to itself. But once we decided, what we were building, there a few things became obvious that like we needed to make it work.
And so building a community from scratch is hard, as anyone that has ever maintained a forum, a mailing list, a Slack channel, a Discord group. What were the most important lessons that you've learned building dev.to from scratch? Because it's hard to build awareness. It's hard to build trust with folks and saying, you can come here and get your questions answered. You can come here and write your blog post and get good feedback. What was your, and without getting into probably any of the secrets, but the secret sauce for kind of figuring this out?
Well, I think the secret is what we're just talking about, is having that Twitter account. So, it building it, like the whole concept, like build it and they will come, is just like totally not reality. But because we had this sort of way of amplifying for folks, because we had tens of thousands of followers at that point, it like we could encourage folks to post on dev, and then we would be sharing that content through social. And I think that gave authors more visibility. On places like Medium, where your Twitter account is like pretty connected with your Medium account. So it's like if you're really famous on Twitter, you can probably be famous on Medium. And for us, it was about like elevating just quality content, and that could be coming from somebody who's not Twitter famous. And so having that account to help amplify other people's content, I think was a big key to our success there. But I have memories of just like reaching out to people. Like one of the first things we built was to be able to consume an RSS feed so people can cross post a lot more easily and like maintain their canonical URL. So one of like we were doing like lots of manual outreach, like, hey, like check out Dev, like you have great articles, like do you want to post on Dev? And like so like that there was definitely that phase of the business. But it's great that you're asking this question, because right now, as we're supporting other creators, other community builders to build their forums, and as we just launched a Code Newbie forum as well, we're sort of in many ways like back to square one, back to figuring out like, oh, like what is this playbook for supporting a community, ensuring it's a place that is actually useful for the community that we are targeting. And so we're kind of applying some of what we learned through Dev, but also learning new ways to engage and add value to different communities.
And so the key part to also community building is creating this healthy atmosphere where folks don't feel like there's a lot of pressure on them, where they feel like they can speak their mind within reasonable boundaries. What's your take on fostering that community? Because you're going to have moderators, you can enforce the rules yourselves, but over time, it needs to scale somehow, right? It's probably hard to do it when you serve a global audience, because you have folks that are coming from all over the globe that I'm sure are active all hours of the day, not just the 12 hours whenever we're on East Coast or West Coast time. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is leading by example. Like any of the content or initiatives that we put out, we we really like stand by our code of conduct. We try to make things as approachable as possible. But yeah, not only do we, not only do we stand by our code of conduct and like, you know, apply the code of conduct to ourselves, but we really enforce it too. And so, we're not afraid to ban people who are crossing the line, and we're pretty strict about what that means. And we take like each case like pretty seriously. There's a very human element of moderation for us that isn't just you know automated through our systems.
Which I feel like is the easy way out for a lot of folks of saying, oh, I'll just put the spam filter, will block everything. But there's so much that's kind of it's in between, where it's like it needs human attention. And
Yeah.
it's great that you're still having human attention on these issues, and it's not just auto ban or just completely kind of spam block and says, hey, I just shared a link to my blog. This is not spam.
Yeah, and it's like it's not just human, like it's not just like human intervention. I think it's like ensuring that there's someone at the company who cares about it. Like we have, we're not just like farming out our moderation to like a third party, because I feel like I mean so many platforms do that, and um they lose that connection with the company itself, and then they're falling into that situation where it's just like a flow chart of like yes, no, do this, do that, and there's no one there to like sort of step in and talk about the gray areas.
And dev.to is also used not only by folks like myself and my peers, but also by companies. So we've seen posts coming from Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services. Did you expect this when you bootstrap this community, that it's not going to be only a forum for folks that are early in their career, that are learning, or maybe even veteran folks that are sharing their insights, but also companies?
Yeah, I'd say this is definitely one of those plan for opportunism moments. We were definitely, reaching out and thinking more about individual bloggers. But a lot of those folks happen to be developer advocates who work at larger companies and realized that what we were doing and how we were growing as a community, and then it just became really quite natural to start supporting these organization accounts. It also was a natural we actually had organization accounts quite early, but we've never actually done any pushes for orgs to create accounts, but we had created that originally just so we could have our organization account and have posts under the org as just dev staff, and that proved to be useful for some of these companies that are looking to reach developers and have valuable content to share.
And it's one of those things where I feel like companies go where developers are. And in this case, developers are on dev.to. And this is where it feels the natural place to discover relevant information. And to me, myself, I found myself in a lot of situations where I'm researching a topic and then I land on dev.to and I start just scrolling through the blog posts that are available. And, oh, there's also this and this. And a community member posted this. And there's somebody from this company posted this. And it adds this multi-tiered approach of, I want to say, adding almost legitimacy to the content where I know that it's trustworthy because I see people saying, and then I see a company saying this, and it kind of supports each other.
Yeah, well, that's awesome to hear.
So the system that is powering dev.to is Forem. And it's one of those things that I find it fascinating that there's a whole separate open source project that was built entirely for this. So again, you took a non-traditional approach to this because any other community that is started today, or a lot of them, would take the easy way. Hey, we'll start a Slack group, and we'll start inviting people, and we'll put a type form in front of it and put your email, we'll invite you. Or a new Discord, or somebody's going to be using a board like PHPBB or vBulletin, back from the days when vBulletin was that jam. And tell us more about this project. Tell us more about Forem.
Yeah, so what you're describing is actually one of the primary reasons people switched to Forem, because Slack couldn't scale for them. Slack is just for synchronous communication, especially if you have a big community, talking 10,000 people plus, and Slack has all these pricing tiers. It becomes immediately unsustainable for you if you are just doing this as a hobby or a side project. So Forem is a place for communities to connect in a less synchronous way, in a way where that information can be shared throughout. And I feel like I kind of got lost on your original question because I got excited when you were talking about vBulletin and Slack. But
vBulletin was great.
Yeah. Yeah, so Forem, the name itself, is sort of a throwback to that concept of a forum. So we're spelled Forem. For a while, for us, that means it's for empowering thoughtful connection. And the open source part, that's what you had asked originally. So yeah, that definitely was not a traditional route. So we kind of always knew we wanted to open source, mostly because we believed in the power of open source, and it was just a matter of when. So we open sourced Dev in summer of 2018. And so that was just all the dev stuff was still hard coded in there. It was very, very specific to the developer community and the needs we had there. And essentially since then, I guess for the past 2 or so years, we've been working on generalizing the app so that all the dev specific things are pulled out and that you can use that to self-host your own community. And then for us, our offering is a hosted solution so that you don't have to jump through the hoops of self-hosting. But open sourcing has been such a game changer. I truly believe open source code blossoms and closed source decays. We have over, I think, 550 people who have contributed to the code base. It's great to have so many eyes on our code, just helping us look out for things, but also it's enabled people to be creative and make contributions to different features, and I actually see a lot more opportunity for that once we have more support for the different APIs and like, ability to create different plugins for forums, that if you're doing a forum in a totally different industry where you might want like video support or something like that, like I think there's just like a lot that can be created because we're open source.
And in startup world, founders are often hesitant to open source their project because then you're giving away, well, what I referred to earlier as the secret sauce, because now everyone can grab your code, modify it, tweak it slightly, bootstrap their own community, or they can take your code and pretty much create a competitor, or maybe they'll fork your project and they'll be slightly different, but now you have somebody that's essentially competing with you based on the work that you've created. What's your take on that? Because I'm sure it's not an easy decision.
Yeah, so I mean, right now we're actually very encouraging of people who want to self-host. We ask them to like reach out to us and collaborate with us. It helps us learn about issues that they run into. We want it to be like, pretty seamless for people to be able to do that on their own, and it's not in a sense that gives us this automatic free tier, which is kind of nice to offer. And then I think it's fair to assume that most of the community creators, builders out there are not going to be developers. And even if they are, and like we actually have some companies that work with us. So like New Relic just launched the Relicans, which is how they are supporting and communicating with their community. And even, a big company like that with plenty of developer resources, I don't, that they're also not self-hosting, so it's like self-hosting is a great option for people who have like the time and resources and knowledge to do that. But the vast majority of folks would rather pay for the hosted version, which is what we have to offer them. So, I think that's just how we're approaching like, working through what it means to be an open source company. But also, like we hold the product vision. So if someone were to, take our code, tweak a little bit, they don't, know what we have up our sleeves for the next few years and how we're approaching this. And they don't have like the experience of getting to where we are now. And so I'm sure, like people can try, but I'm not too worried about it. Because we've been fostering our community and I think trust in our brand and what we've been doing for a long time, and I really believe that that'll carry us along.
You're focusing on delivering value first to your customers, and that is the most important component of this, and everything else just naturally comes with it, which makes sense. If customers love your product, they'll always go to your product. If customers know they can trust your work, they can trust how you're approaching their feedback, that's all that matters. And to that extent, we're talking about the roadmap and putting things together. And actually, on your point of self-host versus hosting, it took me back to the days of vBulletin again, when I thought I would be clever and host my own forum, and then realized just how hard it is to self-host and patch things and make sure that you get, your traffic of 100 concurrent users all of a sudden takes down the server. It's hard.
Yeah.
Self-hosting is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. It really is not an easy task and really takes somebody who's very, very committed to make that work. And, we commend them for doing so and want to learn from them and like what they run into while they do that.
And especially when it comes to scale, I'm sure, if you're running a community of 100 people, that part is easy. When you get into the thousands and you need to have a CDN, and now all of a sudden you need to make sure that you have load balancers in front, like it just becomes very, very hard to manage. But I'm curious about the roadmap. And you mentioned that you kind of hold the keys to the roadmap, to the vision for the product. And given that it's an open source product, there exists that duality of, because it's open source, folks kind of expect to say, hey, I can do a feature request. I'll just go to GitHub issues, open a niche and say, hey, I want this community to have, like I said, video support, or maybe embedding from Vimeo. How do you balance that between what you and your team knows it needs to happen. So because you have your vision, you're executing on it, versus what the community is asking for. Because it's a very active GitHub project. I've seen it, and there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of asks. How do you balance that out?
Yeah. So we have a open source community manager, Christina Gorton, who really has her ears to the ground as to what the community is asking for and what they need. And so she works with our engineering team to articulate and advocate for the community. So, as always, like a PR that fixes a bug is always going to be easier to get through than a PR that's like a brand new feature request that maybe they didn't even make the request and just created that that PR. So it's sort of about communication. We try and be clear that like not everything's going to get through. Like we really appreciate your time. Like we don't want to waste your time. So that like that's just sort of how we manage the community. But on the sort of product roadmap front, that's actually something we've been putting a lot of work into these past few weeks and months. I think we've grown quite a bit, and we were like in the early days, it was easy to not really have a product roadmap because it was like pretty obvious what areas needed contributions, and we're kind of able to say yes to a lot of things. But now that the platform is so much more mature, we need to be a lot more deliberate. So right now we're actually, really trying to figure out like what is the best way to make decisions through our product roadmap. And yeah, we're just doing a lot of product work right now to help enable our team to, not just see the 30,000 mile view of things, but to get that 500-foot view of where things are going. And that's something that we actually hope to share with the community soon too, to like really bridge that expectation setting with the community. So people will understand more, if we're saying like, hey, like we're not going to take this feature right now. And then they have a place to really see what are we prioritizing? So that's something we really need to get better at, and something that we're currently working on.
It's hard to say no. It's one of those
Yeah.
arts of product management where I've seen it firsthand when, especially in an open source project, where there's that little bit of almost, I don't want to call it entitlement because it's too harsh of a word, but more of it's open source. This means I can tell them to do whatever I want for my scenario. And oftentimes you figure out that what this person is asking is actually serving, one person. That's it. And saying no without showing the trust and saying, we still value your feedback. We still want you to continue giving us the feedback. It's just this particular item is not on our roadmap. It's not yet something that we want to do. It's a bit of an art.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it always gets more complicated when you say yes to something, but then like as someone is implementing, you discover like all the other stuff that comes along with it. So that small little project becomes so much bigger, and then you're like, oh, like my resource allocation and you kind of go back to the drawing board, and then some heartburn gets created. And yeah, that's sort of like the beauty of making software.
Right. Saying yes often has more ramifications than just saying no.
Yeah.
So with running a large community, running a startup, you're doing so many things. How do you balance everything in your life and work? What's your approach to recharging and refreshing and coming to work excited?
Yeah, for me personally, I have achieved so much more work-life balance now that we're like a 40-person company than when we were like a 15-person company. I think early on, I think I've come to learn that I can't be sprinting the entire time, and that this is truly a marathon. And so like, breaks are allowed, and you need to like drink water and eat snacks along the way. Um, because yeah, early on it was like Slack was on all the time, of constantly available. And then as you start burning out on that, you're like, oh, like that's actually not a like it's like diminishing returns right now. And so it it's interesting, like as you transition to having more people on your team. Like for me personally, I've learned to like delegate a lot more, and essentially just like trust in the team and the people around me supporting everything that's going on. And so Yeah, it's funny because like now I feel like I have work-life balance, and it's something we want, everyone on our team to also have. And so I actually try really hard like not to be on Slack or doing work, at least not like visibly. So that we're leading by example there. Like me, Ben, and Peter, like all try really hard. Like if we say we're offline, to like actually be offline, because otherwise you're setting that precedent that it's like that you should be working if you're traveling that day, and you shouldn't. So that's something that we're all working on, and I think that Ben and Peter's work-life balance have also improved in the last few years too. So yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive.
It's interesting because it kind of dovetails some of the things that another guest on our podcast, Mayuko Inoue, mentioned a couple of weeks ago around the hustle culture, and how there's often this concept of you can only succeed as a startup if you're hustling, 24/7, no weekends, no breaks, just push at it. And here you are showing us that you can build an amazing thing without working 24/7 and still having time for things in your life that are important, because work is a part of it, but it's not everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important to reset. Otherwise, you're just not thinking clearly, and you end up like operating on like exhaust fumes and emotions, and that's not helpful for any like yourself or anyone around you.
And you can only go on fumes for so long before
Yeah.
it starts backfiring, causing more issues.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to someone that looks at you as an inspiration and thinks that I want to follow in those career footsteps? What should they do?
Well, since I didn't follow a certain path, I guess I'd go back to what I was saying earlier, which is plan for opportunism. Sort of take it one step at a time, but be really open-minded about what the opportunities are. Because if you're not open-minded about them, you're just not going to see any of the opportunities, or you won't interpret them as such. So, yeah, keep an open mind, and stay curious.
This is wonderful advice. And I know we're getting to the top of the hour, and I want to ask you about the 2 podcasts that you have coming up. So tell us more about those projects.
Yeah, so the dev community, we put out we have 2 original shows. One is called Dev Discuss, and that is similar to this. It's an interview format, but it's with me and my co-founder Ben, and we just cover topics across software. So we'll have episodes on like Vim, or um, uh like anything like related to your career, so like career transitioning, just sort of the whole gamut that might interest developers. And then we also have a show called Dev News, and that covers just things that are happening in the industry, and it's really quite fun. And that's hosted by Saron Yipbarek, who is also the co-host of the Code Newbie podcast, which is also in our family of podcasts, and then Josh Pitts, who is a principal engineer at Forem. And that show is just so much fun there. I like love that show more than Dev Discuss, but only because I'm like critical on myself sometimes. But yeah, Dev News is a really fantastic way to keep up with the news in the industry.
Right after this recording, I'm hitting subscribe on literally all of them, because I love podcasts, and to me, discovering new shows. This was an unexpected surprise to today's show, and we'll include links in the show notes so that folks can go there and subscribe in their favorite podcasting app.
Thank you.
So, and another thing that I want to ask you about is there's an initiative that you're driving that's called Nevertheless She Coded, that's coming up. Tell us more about what it is.
Yeah, so Nevertheless She Coded is something we came up with 5 years ago. So this will be our 5th celebration, where we just celebrate women who code. And it's a day. So International Women's Day is March 8th. And so starting in March, we encourage women to share their stories and how, their coding journeys, how they got into coding. They share their advice for other women. We also have allies share how they, plan to support women. And so, so on March 8th, we'll be amplifying stories from women who code, just, all across the internet, so that we can just inspire more women to join this industry.
Jess, where can people find you online if they want to follow you? Where should they go?
Yeah, so if you're a developer, you can follow me on dev.to, dev.to/Jess, or you can follow me on Twitter at Jess Lee NYC.
Wonderful. Well, Jess, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for coming on our show. And I hope that we get to chat with you sometime again in the future once Forem becomes a multi-million-dollar company with millions of customers. It's going to be so exciting to learn from you.
Would love to. And yeah, thank you so much for having me today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jess.
Bye, Den.